Hello and welcome everybody to our National Sewing Circle Q&A. We are here for about an hour, and before I officially bring on who will be answering your questions, I just have a quick reminder for you to check the video description and also the chat box. There's going to be a download there for you how to use a serger and serger techniques. So if that's something you're interested in, get access to that video. Again, link in the description or in the chat box. And the chat box is where you will be dropping your questions all session long. We'll get to as many as we possibly can, so you can go ahead and start with some questions or maybe even a hello from where you are viewing from. We love to see our community. And with that being said, it's time to introduce you to who will be answering your questions. Nicki LaFoille is with us today. Hi, Nicki. How are you doing?
Hi, Leah. Hi, everyone. I'm great. Just staying warm, as I hope everyone in these colder climates is. I've got my blanket in my lap today, and I'm ready to talk about sewing.
Fantastic. I also have a blanket in my lap, and I'm ready to talk about sewing. So if there's nothing that you want to kind of kick us off with, I'm going to drop into some questions right off the bat. Do you have anything you want to make sure we hit today, Nicki?
Nothing specific, but I always love talking about sewing machine tension. So if anybody has questions about tension, about sewing machine needles, specific techniques, or anything that's on your plate, throw them at me. But otherwise, let's dig in.
All right, perfect. We do have a few questions that are already in here, so we are ready to go. We're going to go to Eileen's question first. So Eileen is making a mayo. Eileen, I'm trying to say that correctly. Hopefully I got it. A mayo bathing suit, and wants to ruche one side to create a diagonal appearance. I cannot seem to figure out exactly how to do it. Nicki, is there a method that she should know? She says, thank you for your time and consideration. So thank you for sending that in, Eileen. Nicki, what do you think?
Yes, absolutely, Eileen. So that type of bathing suit, from my understanding, is a one-piece bathing suit. So this ruching effect is really attractive on bathing suits because it gives you an element of so this ruching technique, if you're doing it on both sides, it's fairly easy because you can just create the pattern piece longer and gather it up on the side seams. But if you're only doing one side, that's when it gets a little bit tricky. So I don't have a bathing suit pattern piece right here, so let's just pretend that this is a bathing suit pattern piece. So to create the gathers on one side, you need to create more space, add more fabric in on the one side. So you can do that by simply slashing and spreading the pattern. So pretend these darts don't exist. So honestly, along this side seam, depending on how much ruching you want, you can choose some spots along the side seam, evenly spaced probably, and draw yourself a line. And the further over you go, the further over that extra fabric of the ruching will go. So come in quarter, probably maybe even over the center line, depending on how far over you want those fabric folds to go. So draw yourself a line, and you're going to slash along that line and spread it open. So you're creating more space in the side seam. So when you have all of your slashes open and spread, say we were just doing this to the top pattern piece of this, the pattern piece would come down like this along the side seam. So this side seam would be a lot longer than this center front seam because we have so many openings along this side. So having all this extra fabric here, you would then either throw some basting stitches in here to gather it back up, or you could just take those extra, because we're essentially creating darts, except we're not going to sew them all out. We're leaving that fabric to create kind of folds along the front. You can gather, or you can simply fold that extra fabric back under to create the extra, the ruching effect, the extra fabric folds along that front. And then throw another line of stitching to secure all of those gathers or folds, and then create the rest of the pattern piece per the instructions. Now, that technique that I just described is going to create lines of ruching that go more across, more horizontal. So if you want those ruching lines to create a more diagonal effect, draw your slash lines diagonally and cut those diagonally. And when you open and spread along the side seam, if you've ever transferred a dart around a pattern before, you will know that you then need to fold that dart back in to get these little triangular shaped extra bits at the edge of the dart, so that when you stitch or when you fold that dart back out or that ruching back out, it will be even along the side seam. So when you are altering your pattern, putting extra paper down underneath all of your slash and open lines, fold that pattern back along those the slash lines that you made, and draw that so that when you open it up, you get a little triangle, so that then when you fold it back, you have enough fabric in your side seam to hold that little fold down. And you can also enter into your search bar ruching technique or side seam ruching, and you'll probably get a more in-depth tutorial than me and my scraps of paper. But hopefully that gives you a general idea of that technique.
All right, I'm going to get a few hellos in before we get to our next question. So we have to say hi to Judy and Carol and P. Belfour in Ontario. Bonnie's here from Kansas City and Christine in North Carolina. So we've got quite a few people from all over. Hopefully, like you said, everybody's staying warm. And we're getting to as many questions as possible. And Sharon is next. So Sharon says that I struggle with all of the decorations, all of the directions and lines on the rulers. So how about some basic instructions for triangle or large rulers? What are tips that you have for those kind of things?
So I don't have my ruler with me. It's upstairs in my sewing room, but I use just like an omni grid. It's, I think, 24 inches long by 6 inches wide. And I love that ruler because it's not necessarily grippy on the back, but it has like the paint that they use to paint the lines on the back, which gives it a little bit of grip on your fabric. So throw that in there. I personally have never used a triangle ruler. So unfortunately, I don't have tips for that. But Creative Grids does triangle rulers and some square rulers for quilting and such. And they actually have some good videos on their YouTube channel, which is Creative Grids USA, for tutorials and tips for using their rulers. So that might be a resource to check out. But otherwise, I would say the line on the ruler that can be kind of confusing for a lot of people is the 45-degree angle line. And sometimes there are even more lines than the 45-degree angle. So you got your ruler, and if there's a line going, diagonal at a 45-degree angle, that's so that you can find the bias of a fabric. So you can align your ruler along the lengthwise and crosswise grain, and then that line on the ruler is your true bias, so your true 45-degree angle line. So that's a marking that can be, not necessarily self-explanatory. So that's what that one is. But yeah, otherwise, I know there are some rulers too that have a 1/2 inch. I've seen Ashley Huff use this, and she does a lot of quilting, and it always seemed a little bit confusing to me because my ruler is 6 inches wide, and I have a ruler that's 2 inches wide too. And to have like an extra 1/2 inch on a ruler, I know there's a purpose for it. I don't know what that purpose is, but if you see a ruler that has that, or if you have a ruler that has that and you do not know why, there's probably a purpose for it. But you need to pay close attention to that so that you pay close attention to those markings on your ruler so that you know exactly what measurements you're getting. But other than that, that's all I've got for ruler tips.
Okay, this sounds like a good one too to maybe crowdsource a bit. If you are watching and you have great tips or somewhere you've found great tips for rulers, you can go ahead and drop that in the chat box as well. We love a bit of crowdsourcing during our Q&As. We're going to talk about fabric with our next question here, Nicki, and this comes from Bonnie. Bonnie wants to know if after buying fabric, do you finish the edges and then wash it?
So this will depend a little bit on the type of fabric. If it's just a quilting cotton, I won't finish the edges, but a good tip for making sure your edges don't ravel and create a big, gnarly, tangled mess in the washer and dryer is to unfold your yardage and then fold it so that the raw edges are aligned, and just throw a basting stitch along that edge. Backstitch at the beginning and end so that it will hold through washing and drying. But keeping those edges together helps to minimize the fraying and all of the friction that happens in washing and drying. Helps keep it sort of contained so that you don't get a whole, a mess of thread tangled together. But I do always wash my fabric after I bring it home from the store for several reasons. Pre-shrinking, of course. A lot of my fabric, I'm bringing it home to make garments. And I know I'm going to be putting my garments through a lot of wear and washing, and I want to eliminate any shrinkage first before I cut out my pattern pieces to make sure then that garment is going to fit me when I cut it out and sew it up. Also, when fabric comes to the fabric store from the manufacturer, sometimes it has excess dye in it, or what they call sizing, which is a kind of coating almost that some manufacturers will put on their fabric to protect it from color bleaching, from the elements, etc. So that coating, you want to wash that off for sure so that you can get, the true feel of the fabric, and so that the fabric will drape and act the way that it is naturally meant to act as you start to use that fabric. So this is kind of a hot topic. Some people, there are reasons that some people do not pre-wash their fabric, especially quilters. But personally, I always do. If it is a fabric that ravels a lot, like rayon or some types of acetate and lining fabrics, I can see where that would be a really good time to throw a zigzag stitch in both of those raw edges, or some other overcast stitch, or if you have a serger, fling it through your serger just to encase those raw edges and protect those raw edges so that you don't lose a lot of your fabric to fraying and you don't get a huge mess in your washing machine.
All right, since you mentioned the serger, I'm actually going to jump to Linda's question next. Linda's in Texas and wants to know what a serger is and why is it worth buying? What does it do that a sewing machine does not? So talk a little bit about sergers here.
So a serger is a machine that a lot of sewists use for sewing knits, or simply for overcasting edges, so finishing off your raw edges. And of course, you can use your serger in a lot of, you can use it for sewing your woven fabrics as well. The serger can come with 3 needles or 4 needles, and your 4 needle serger can be changed so that you can use all 4 needles or just 3. And I do have a serger. I don't use it a lot because I don't have space in my sewing room, unfortunately. I do everything I need to do on my sewing machine, but a lot of people love the serger because it is faster than a sewing machine. It overcasts edges, so it finishes your seam allowances and sews your project all in one go. So it eliminates what is an extra step when you're sewing on a sewing machine. The serger also has a knife to trim off some of your seam allowance. So it creates a nice finished seam allowance, and you can change the settings on the knife to have it cut off more or less or disengage it altogether. But the serger seam has a built-in stretch to it, which makes it really good for sewing knits. So if you sew a lot of knit fabrics, knit garments, a serger is a really useful thing because it creates a really strong seam, because it has 2 needles for the loopers and 2 needles for the stitches. And like I said, you can make adjustments to that for different effects on your serger. There's a really good Craftsy class. I think it's by Amy Allen, and she goes through a whole bunch of different settings on a serger, and it's really, really clear and just a really good class. So if you are interested in that, check that out on Craftsy. But that is why some people just swear by their serger. And I know a lot of people are scared of sergers. And I think there are a lot of serger videos on National Sewing Circle as well, to get people more comfortable with their serger, because it's not as scary as it seems. I know there's a lot of moving parts, but once you figure it out, it can be a really, really useful tool.
And it seems like a really good time to toss a reminder. Today, you can check out the link in the video description, or I believe eventually it's going to show up in our chat box, how to use a serger and serger techniques. So this is a great day to ask some serger questions and also pick up that free download as well from National Sewing Circle. We're going to move on to tools with our next question here, Nicki, and this comes from Jody. Jody wants to know, where can I send my expensive sewing scissors and pinking shears for any care, sharpening, things like that?
That is a really good question, and I think that is going to depend on where you are. You can talk to local sewing machine dealers. Sometimes they will, if they don't have someone there who will do it, they might know of somewhere you can bring them or send them to do it. And that would probably be a good internet search too, where to sharpen sewing scissors, or some keywords to that effect, to find places to do that. And so my Ginger shears here, I've been using for many years, haven't had to sharpen them yet, but when I do have to sharpen them, I probably will try to find a professional to do it. But there are times when you might be able to do a little bit of sharpening on your own. And I will do this. Let's see if I don't have my rotary cutter down here, but I will do this when my rotary cutter blade starts getting dull. I will take a sheet of tinfoil and fold it 2 or 3 times to get like 6 or 8 layers of tinfoil, and run my rotary cutter up that tinfoil 4 or 5 times. And that metal on that blade is enough to just give it a little sharpening, to eke out a little bit more life out of my rotary cutter blades. If you get a nick in your blade, if you hit a pin or something, the tinfoil trick isn't probably going to help with that. But if you just need a little bit of sharpening up of a dull rotary cutter blade, or some other scissors, you can take scissors and clip into the tinfoil that way as well. But my Ginger shears are so very dear to me and such a good investment that I probably will send these to a professional instead of doing that little shortcut trick. But the shortcut trick is useful, and it's there for you if you need it.
All right. Oh, we have a tip that just came in from Sharon. Sharon says, I also wash my fabric in vinegar and then rinse, and it helps keep the colors from fading. So thank you for adding that thought in there, Sharon. Let's move to Lillian's question next, right back to sergers here. So Lillian's in Florida, got a serger for Christmas, and a rookie at sewing, and I love it. All right, that's it. Really exciting. Thanks for joining us today, Lillian. Now, Lillian wants to know the only thing is how to end the sewing. That is really confusing with the serger for her. So what do you have to say about that?
Yes. So when you sew on a serger, you get that chain of stitching kind of. So when you come back, if you're sewing something that kind of comes back around on itself, or even at the end of a stitching line, all you really need to do is kind of curve that chain away from the project. And as you are, if you have a project that the stitching line kind of comes back onto itself, and if you have your blade engaged, you want to make sure that you curve that sewing line away from the project before you get back to where the stitching started, because you don't want to accidentally cut any of your previous the previous stitching as you get back to it. So from my understanding, if you just sort of pull that fabric away or kind of curve it away, that you can end your stitching line, and then the chain of serger stitches sort of holds itself together. So if you cut it, I don't think it will ravel, but if you want to make sure that that is not backstitched, but secured as a backstitch would do on a sewing machine, you can cut your stitching and leave a little bit of threads at the end of your stitching line, and you can tie those off if you feel that you want that extra security. Use a little fray check at the end of the stitching line as well to really secure those threads.
Okay, we're going to Margaret's question next. Now, Margaret is under 5 feet tall and wants to know what places should she alter in a pattern to get regular patterns to fit. I understand most patterns are made for someone 5 foot 8 inches tall, around there.
Yes, so that's the trouble with commercial patterns, is they kind of make them for the average, whatever that means. So it's not going to be a perfect fit from the get-go for most people. So you have to do a little bit of altering. For someone shorter, if you are having to take things up a lot, there are often lengthen or shorten lines on the pattern, which are a really good indicator of where you can slash and take it in, essentially. So a lengthen shorten line will typically be under the arm's eye somewhere, and you can really slash along that line and bring that fabric or bring that pattern up to shorten something. And if your pattern does not have a lengthen shorten line, you can slash across and bring it down wherever there is. I'd say do it below the arm side probably, and it depends on the pattern too if there are other elements going on, but typically it's going to be somewhere in the middle here below the arm side. I mean, you can of course shorten up here as well if the arm size is too large. So you can slash and tuck that down as well. But a lot of times you are not going to know where in a pattern you might need these alterations until you create a mock-up. So that's an important step that is annoying and a lot of people skip, but it's really important if you want to get a final finished product in your awesome, cute fabric that you bought. So making a mock-up in a sort of similar fabric or in a muslin, and you don't have to finish the whole thing even. Use basting stitches. You don't even necessarily need to put the sleeves on if there are sleeves on the pattern. Just create like a skeleton kind of pattern in your muslin to try on, see where are problem issues and where you can, where you need to take up. If it's here, if the arm size is too big, you can take it out of here. And then you can transfer those markings from your muslin onto the pattern so that then when you cut out the pattern in your cute final fabric, you will have fewer alterations to do, if any, to get your finished product looking perfect and like it fits like it was made for you. To shorten bottoms, it's a lot easier a lot of times because a lot of times you can just take it off from the bottom. But there will be lengthen, shorten lines a lot of times somewhere below the hip curve. So this one has a nice line on it to show you where would be a good lengthen, shorten line. So it's below this curve of the hip where it gets to be a little bit more straight and there's not, darts and curves going on. So that's a good place to shorten a skirt. But again, it does kind of depend on what elements you have going in a skirt.
Okay, I know that you mentioned at the top of our time together, Nicki, that you love talking about tension. So this next question is for you. It comes in from Carrie. Carrie wants to know, where can I go for tension issues? It looks like the trouble is on the bottom. I'm going to let you get started with that. But Carrie, if there's any more detail that you want to add as well as Nicki is talking, just drop that into the chat box and we'll add on.
Yes. So tension issues can be very frustrating because it is a lot of times hard to know what is going wrong. I do have a video on nationalsewingcircle.com. I think it's part of the intermediate sewing skills video. I have a section on tension troubleshooting, but I'll go through my checklist with you. So when you're having tension problems, and if the problems look like they're on the bottom of the fabric, a lot of times that is an issue with the needle thread. And conversely, if you have a problem with like threadness on the top of the fabric, it is a lot of times an issue with the bobbin. But to start, whenever I have tension issues, I usually look first. Okay, let me take a step back here. First, take the thread and the bobbin off of your machine and rethread it. A lot of times sewists think, of course I threaded my machine right. I've been doing this for X number of years. But when you have that muscle memory, you kind of go on autopilot sometimes when you're threading your machine and mistakes can happen. So pay attention to every place on your machine where the thread is supposed to touch. If you miss a place, you're missing. Every place the thread touches on the machine adds a little bit of tension, adds necessary tension to the thread. And if you miss one of those, it's going to screw up the whole tension of the machine. So double check that the needle thread is threaded correctly. Double check that your bobbin is inserted correctly. Double check that you have the right type of bobbin in your machine. If you have multiple machines in your house, bobbins are not always interchangeable, especially between brands. So make sure, sometimes bobbins will be taller, a different circumference. Make sure you have the right bobbin in your machine. Make sure that your needle is not dull. A dull needle is a huge cause of tension issues. When a needle starts getting dull, it has a harder time going through the fabric and making that connection with the bobbin thread. So if you're getting skip stitches, a lot of times that is a dull needle. Sometimes threadness can result from that as well. So about 6 hours of sewing time on a needle is kind of the life of a needle, but that depends on what type of fabric you're sewing. If you're sewing on fleece, felt, leather, faux leather, minky, flannel, battings that have like the thermo like stuff that you use for oven mitts and stuff, that will dull your needle quicker. Keep an eye on that. whenever I start having tension issues, I always just change my needle. Flagging is a red flag for that too. So when the fabric starts kind of jumping up and down on your machine bed, when the needle starts going through it, often you'll hear a thunk, thunk, thunk sound as well. That's called flagging. That's a dull needle. Change your needle. Make sure that there's not dust and lint built up in your machine. That can cause tension issues because you're just gunking up the machine, making it harder for the thread to go along the thread path. Take your throat plate off. Use the little brush that comes with your machine, swizzle it around in there and get all the lint out from your bobbin case area. Open up your tension discs. So open up your tension to the widest setting. Take a piece of cotton fabric, fold it in half, and kind of floss it out between those tension discs to get rid of the dust and debris. If you sew on fabric that has a lot of lint, like fleece is really good for releasing lint. If you sew a lot of fleece, you will get a lot of stuff coming out of your machine just by cleaning it out. Make sure your thread path is clean of debris for your thread. Make sure you're using the right combination of needle and thread. So a needle has an eye that is a certain size. If you try using a thread that is too big to go through the needle eye, you're going to get a lot of tension issues. If you're trying to use a thicker thread, like a heavyweight thread or a top stitch thread, use either a larger size needle or go to a top stitch needle or a metallic needle. Those have elongated eyes specifically for thicker thread. One note about needle size, you do also want to kind of match your needle size to your fabric. So if you're stitching on like a lighter weight fabric, you don't want to use a size 100 needle because you will punch bigger holes in your fabric. And especially if you're not using a heavyweight or top stitch thread to fill up those holes, if you're using a regular weight thread, you will get see-through holes in your fabric. So side note on that. Sometimes machines will do weird things. I had a brother machine that I was trying to sew on leather. I was making a leather purse. So I was using heavyweight thread and I wanted to use a roller foot to help that leather slide under the foot. For some reason, that brother machine said, not gonna allow it. When I was using the roller foot and the heavyweight thread, tension issues, skip stitches, did not like it. I had to put my regular foot back on and then everything was fine. So if you're using a different foot, sometimes that changes the way the fabric goes under the foot and the connection that the thread makes. So keep that in mind. That's like probably not the issue, but also could be the issue. So for tension, make sure you're also winding your bobbins correctly. If you are winding your bobbin at breakneck speed, it puts more tension on the bobbin thread, and that can cause issues when that thread comes off the bobbin and into your seam. So wind your bobbins with a nice, even, medium speed. Avoid stopping and starting a lot. Just put your foot on the pedal, medium speed, and keep it there until the bobbin is full. I think those are all of my tension tips. Hopefully one of those things will clear up your issue.
Absolutely. Carrie, good luck. Like she said, I hope that helps for you. I feel like we got a lot of good tension tips in there too, for not just Carrie, anybody that's struggling with tension issues. We've got our next question coming in from Carmen here, and we're going to jump a little bit back into a tools discussion. So going back to the pinking shears that we were talking about earlier and sharpening, Carmen says, my teacher once told us that once your pinking shears are not sharp, you just have to replace them. Is that true? What are your thoughts on that, Nicki?
I don't think that is true. I have I have never sharpened my pinking shears, but I have seen tutorials online of how to sharpen your pinking shears. So that makes me think that somebody knows what they're doing and somebody knows how to sharpen pinking shears. So yeah, I don't think it's like when they get dull, you have to just throw them away. That wouldn't make sense to me. I think there's got to be a way to do it either at home by yourself or, like we were talking about earlier, send them in somewhere and have a professional do it. But I just Googled, can you sharpen pinking shears? And I see some videos and some posts. So I think it can be done. Sorry, I don't have more information than that, but I think if you do an internet search, you'll be able to see some of how to do it.
Perfect. We always want to lengthen the life of the tools that we have if we can. So that's pretty promising. Lillian's got our next question. Lillian wants to know, what is the best place to look at for sewing patterns for people over 60? Everything that I've looked for seems to be for people with skinny waists and not for people within that age range. So do you have any suggestions, Nicki?
Let's see. I know that there are a lot of indie pattern companies that do things a little bit differently than like the big three pattern companies that do kind of target a younger age range. I don't have any specific suggestions, unfortunately. I get a lot of patterns from Mood. Mood Fabrics actually has some really good patterns. Berta Style is a good one. But again, I'm looking for patterns for myself. So yeah, I don't have any more specific suggestions than that. Let's crowdsource this one. If anybody has any suggestions for a beloved pattern company, I would love to hear it as well.
Yes, please do drop that right into the chat box if you have found something in that age range that you love and would love to share. I'm sure our community, it's not just Lillian that's looking, I'm positive. I'm going to put a quick call out. Time always seems to fly. We're getting into our last quarter of an hour. So if you're hanging on to a question, you want to make sure to get that into the chat box pretty soon here as we get into our little tail end of our time for today. We'll keep on rolling as long as the questions keep on coming in. And we do have a question here from Bonnie. Bonnie wants to know if pinking shears are important to have and how do you use them?
This is a really good question. And I get questions sometimes from people who are just starting to sew asking what tools they need.
Mm-hmm.
And I have a room full of tools, but you really don't need a lot of them. You really just need your sewing machine, pair of scissors, and some fabric, and you're good to go. As you grow in your sewing, you will find a lot of these tools just make things a little bit easier for you. So I use pinking shears a lot for finishing my seam allowances. So I don't really like to add another line of stitching in my seam allowances. A lot of times I just take my pinking shears and I cut my seam allowances. I cut a little bit off, and that little triangular cut will prevent fraying. So that's what I use it for a lot. Sometimes when I'm sewing a project that has a tight curve, like I was sewing masks, face masks for a long time, and I had a stitching line right here in the middle, and that curved stitching line, I would take my pinking shears and cut it. Even though the mask would be fully lined, the pinking shears in that context were used for essentially clipping my curve. So when you have a curved line in sewing and you want to then turn that curve right side out, that seam allowance needs to either open up if you are doing a curve, let's see, concave, convex. I never remember which is which, but the seam allowance will either need to kind of spread open to allow that curve, or it will fold in on itself, and you don't want that seam allowance to fold over on itself and be bulky. So you'll need to either clip for the curve that needs to open up, or cut notches out, cut little pizza slices out of your seam allowance for the curve that will curve in on itself. So when I need to notch out a curve, I just take my pinking shears and cut, and that little triangular cut essentially notches those little pizza slices out of my seam allowance. So I find it really useful for that. And like I said, for finishing seam allowances, but there are other ways to do both of those things. So it's not strictly necessary. And I don't think I answered the question, what are pinking shears? They're like scissors, except when you cut, it makes a little zigzag cut. It's kind of like those scrapbooking scissors that when you cut, it makes a shaped cut. It makes a triangular cut. So that is what they are. And no, they are not strictly necessary, but I do find them quite helpful.
I must add that my first memory of pinking shears was when I, as a child, probably ruined my grandmother's by using them for my little cut projects with scrap paper that I was working on. So probably make sure you store them away from
children. Yeah.
Anyway, that was a really great description of pinking shears. I remember that being my first contact with sewing was actually with the pinking shears. So really helpful information.
They look fun. They look like a fun tool.
Now, I wanted to add on a little bit. You had mentioned tools that you need, maybe don't need, but want to have. We are coming out of a holiday season with a lot of gift giving. For anybody out there that might have received some new tools, anything that maybe they need help organizing or prioritizing, do you have any general tips for when you've expanded your toolkit, but maybe not your space that you work in, that people might use right now?
Yes. So I have, like I said, I have a lot of tools. And one thing that I have loved to use is these little fabric baskets. And I made this basket. I want to say this was a Facebook Live project for National Sewing Circle. So that video might be on the National Sewing Circle website, or Facebook page rather. So instead of having all of my like marking tools and stuff thrown in a drawer, I keep them just right here, right on my sewing desk, so that, because these are the things that I grab most often, and some clips and what have you. I have my little shears in here, my stiletto, and my seam ripper, and my seam gauge normally goes in here too. So just like a little fabric basket that can be as tall or as short as you want it to be. And you can interface it to make it sturdy and strong so that it stays there. I really love these and I use them a lot. So this has been helpful for me in organizing. I know everybody's space is different and everybody's organization style is different, but this is a good organization tip for me. Also, an organization tip, kind of along the same lines actually, for patterns. Storing patterns has always been a struggle because, especially if you're altering the pattern, you have the original pattern and then you have your own pattern paper with your altered pattern. So to store all of that stuff, when I create a new pattern on my pattern paper, I roll it up so it's like in this scroll type thing. And I have a tote in my sewing room where I store all of my scrolls. It looks like I'm an archaeologist with my map scrolls in the corner, but it's kind of like this. This is my tote, and I have these scrolls sticking out the top so that my patterns don't get creases in them from folding, and my tubes of patterns don't get squished because I'm storing them upright. So that made sense for my space. If you don't like that tip, you can also store your patterns and your altered pattern in a gallon Ziploc bag, and then poke a hole in the top of that Ziploc bag and thread it through a hanger and hang it up so that it's not shoved into a drawer or in a tote, and you can kind of see it and you have all of your materials together if you can't fit all the original pattern pieces back in the pattern envelope, that's a good way to keep them together as well. Quick note also about storing fabric. I discovered Marie Kondo gave me this tip to store fabric instead of, stacking it on top of each other in a drawer or in a tote. I folded it up and now I slide them in like files in a little filing drawer so that I can see the side fold of the fabric and know the color and the print and kind of how much I have by how thick that folded fabric is. And I can just kind of look at it so that nothing gets buried again. So those are some tips that have worked for me. Hopefully they can be helpful to you as well.
I almost thought when you started talking about your scrolls that you were going to say a wine bottle storage unit.
Ooh,
with the scrolls in there. I wonder if that would work too.
That's not a bad idea though.
And
Yeah.
you can find them anywhere. So that would be great.
Like
We've got a couple things in here from our viewers, some of the crowdsourcing that you for over 60, McCall's for beginner sewing or simplicity, Alfreda is suggesting. And also Lynn said that there are indie patterns for curvy or over 60 at Muna and Broad and Cashmerette. Also, there's an Instagram handle in here as well, so over 50. So if that's something that grabs your attention, go ahead and look in the chat box for Lynn and Alfreda's suggestions. Ronnie has also had experience taking her pinking shears to the sewing machine repair store. So if you have a local shop that you go to that you have a relationship with, you could probably get some sharpening done there. So thank you to everybody for all of the crowdsourcing that we have going on. We have just a few minutes left. I will keep an eye out for any last minute questions. But Nicki, I was wondering if you could also let us know what you're working on, what's coming up next for you, and things to keep an eye out in the future here.
Yeah, definitely. I do a lot of the Facebook Live videos on National Sewing Circle's Facebook page. They have some different instructors cycling through, so you'll get different perspectives on sewing and different projects from different teachers. I will be on there next February 15th, I want to say. I don't know what project I'm doing yet. If you have ideas of what you want to see, drop them into the chat box and I will definitely take it into consideration. But recently I got some fantastic knit fabric from girlcharlie.com, which is GIRLCHARLEE.com. They're a fantastic online retailer for knit fabrics. And I got some gorgeous fabric from them. So I've been doing things for winter to keep me warm because I hate being cold, obviously, and I live in Michigan, so it's very cold. So I've been making hats. I made some gloves. That was a Facebook Live video. Some gloves with like the convertible flap so that you can use your fingers but also have that flap. So I made those. As soon as I figure out what I'm doing for my next Facebook Live, that'll be the next thing I'm working on. But I have like a little break in my sewing projects right now. But if you are looking for knit fabrics, Girl Charlie is a fantastic resource because they tell you the weight of the fabric. Sometimes online retailers will say lightweight or medium weight, which is a wide range and doesn't really tell you much about how that fabric's going to feel. And Girl Charlie tells you the ounce weight. And the ounce weight, if you see the number in ounces on a fabric page, it's the weight of a square yard of fabric or a square meter, depending on where in the world you are, but they're very similar. So a 9-ounce weight of knit fabric is fairly light, whereas an 11-ounce is more like a fleece that is a little bit heavier, and more the heavier weight, the ounce weight, the heavier the fabric will feel and the warmer it will be. So that is a great resource I just wanted to let you know about. But yeah, that's what's coming up next for me in my sewing room.
All right, fantastic. So like Nicki said, if there is something that you want to see her do a tutorial on, definitely send in your ideas. You could drop them in the chat box or just follow National Sewing Circle. Get into those comment sections and crowdsource a little bit of what you would like to see in the future as well. Nicki, we haven't had any final questions drop in here, so we have reached the end of our time together for this Q&A. Again, a reminder for all of you watching, go ahead and check out the link in the video description, or it is in the chat box as well. A little free download for you, how to use a serger and serger techniques. We did get to chat a little bit about that in more detail with Nicki today. And then, of course, always keep an eye out for the next one. We have one of these every month. We have lots of good questions. Nicki gives lots of good information, and we can't wait to see you for the next one. So on behalf of Nicki and the entire team, my name is Leah. Thank you for joining us today, and we will see you soon. Enjoy your sewing.